Bill Bleyer. This is the second talk Bill Bleyer is doing for us. He last did a talk on one of his previous books about pirates, and it was extremely well attended. We're very happy to have Bill Bleyer with us once again today. So without further ado, I'll turn over the floor to Bill Bleyer. If you have any questions, please feel free to type in the chat. When you get to the end of the presentation, if you'd like to use the raise hand feature, we'll acknowledge you and unmute you, and you can ask your question. So take it away, Bill.
Thanks, Stephen. Quick introduction of bio for those who haven't heard me speak before. I was a Newsday staff writer for 33 years, focusing primarily on history and maritime issues. And I left in 2014 primarily to write Long Island history books. So what you're going to hear tonight is a very quick summary of book number 5 that's actually officially released on Wednesday, I believe, but is already out there selling. More about that later. Okay, so let's get going here. I'm assuming if you're watching this lecture and have interest in American history, you know who George Washington is. Fewer of you probably know who this gentleman is, Robert Townsend. And even during the Revolution, George Washington didn't know who he was and may never have known who he was, but he's a member of what became known as the Culper Spy Ring, which helped fill a vacuum in intelligence that Washington was acutely aware of from the earliest days of the war. And most historians agree that they played a significant role in helping Washington win the war. So there's been interest in this for a while, particularly in the last couple of years, thanks to this series, which people find very dramatic, and historians, at least I do, find very historically inaccurate. And we'll talk a little bit about that later, because I know Turn is very popular. So I'll point out a few of the things where they twisted history a bit. But those 4 seasons of Turn between 2014 and 2017 have galvanized interest in the spy ring like never before. The other problem is a lot of the books, as well as Turn, have turned speculation and legend into fact. So that's the main reason I ended up writing this book. So Washington was very concerned about military intelligence and the lack of it from the beginning of his military career, which was started in the French and Indian War, when he was an officer in the colonial militia in Virginia and accompanied a column of British redcoat regulars on an expedition out to the across the Appalachian Mountains out to the west to fight the French and their Indian allies. Turned out to be a disaster in large part because of a lack of military intelligence. So the British fought in traditional European style. The French took the hints from their Indian allies and fought Indian style, and the British column was almost wiped out because they had no idea what the French were up to or what the Indians were up to, and just stumbled into an ambush. Washington miraculously survived, gathered the survivors, and brought them back to Eastern Virginia. But he learned the lesson and paid attention to the fact that you need to know what the enemy is up to. And the British didn't seem that concerned in the French and Indian War. But when he becomes American commander after Lexington and Concord, before and during and after the Battle of Brooklyn, or the Battle of Long Island, he was very aware of the lack of intelligence and what it almost cost his army to be wiped out. What happened there is the British fleet shows up off of New York Harbor. They go to Staten Island to get ready, and then they attack Brooklyn. Washington had no idea what they were up to, whether they were going to attack Brooklyn, whether they were going to attack Manhattan. He ends up defending both badly. And if it wasn't for wind blowing in the right direction to keep the British fleet in the lower bay, or fog that masked his retreat, his army could have been totally wiped out in the first major battle and the biggest battle of the Revolution if he wasn't able to escape from Brooklyn after the British did something nobody on the American side suspected could happen, which was to do a flanking march far to the east up through Jamaica Pass and get around behind the bulk of the Continental Army. And as I said, it was just the providential wind and fog that allowed them to escape. So Washington knew he needed a spy network, and we'll talk about how he set that up. Historians, ever since the war, have been trying to figure out how it operated, who was in it, and the biggest advance came in the 1930s from this gentleman, Morton Pennypacker, a historian in Suffolk County, who donated all his papers to the library that's hosting us tonight in their Long Island history room. Pennypacker made a lot of advances. Primarily, he's famous for identifying all the key players in the spy ring. In the first book he did in 1930, and then he identified Robert Townsend, whose picture I showed you, done by his nephew in the 1840s, as Culper Jr., the main spy in New York City. And it was sort of his supposition until he acquired some journals and documents and ledgers from the Townsend family in Oyster Bay, which are now in your library out there, and compare the handwriting and had a handwriting expert prove that Robert Townsend was in fact Culper Jr. So ever since, there's been now about a dozen books that either deal entirely with the spy ring or in part with the spy ring. So this is a painting from after the Revolution of Washington's artillery retreating across the East River after nearly being routed at the Battle of Long Island. So Washington escaped, got his troops to Manhattan. Then they were attacked again in a surprise attack by the British up in Kips Bay, up on the East River, and almost got cut off and annihilated in lower Manhattan. So he knew he needed an intelligence network. He knew the British had spies. The British had a very good intelligence gathering network, and he needed to replicate that to have any chance of winning against the biggest and best trained army in the world. So right after the Battle of Long Island, while they're still in Manhattan in August of 1776, he instructs Colonel Thomas Knowlton to form a special unit that will focus entirely on intelligence gathering. And Knowlton quickly organizes a meeting of his officers. They will not entrust spying to enlisted men. They figure they need intelligence disciplined people, which means their officers to go behind enemy lines. So Knowlton lays out the mission that Washington is looking for people to undertake. None of the officers will do it. They know it's extremely dangerous, but even more than the danger, what turns them off is the fact that in the 1700s, spying is considered disreputable activity, particularly for gentlemen, and most of the officers are highly educated or gentlemen, and none of them wants to sully their reputation by doing something that's considered pretty low-grade work. Luckily for Knowlton, one of the officers, Nathan Hale, a young lieutenant, is not at the meeting because he's suffering from illness. He hears about what happened at the meeting and goes the next day to Knowlton and volunteers. And all of Hale's friends in the regiment tell him he should not do this, both because it's not something a gentleman or he's a Yale graduate. They said this is not something somebody with your background should undertake because it'll ruin your reputation. But even more so, Hale is a very kind of open person and gullible and no guile. And his friends tell him, you're not the kind of person that can pull off a cover story, that if you're questioned, you're going to get uncovered very quickly, and this is going to end badly. But Hale says, this is what Hale looks like in statue by City Hall. Hale says, I've been in the Army for a year. I'm collecting a salary. I haven't done anything really to help the cause. I'm going to do this despite the risk. So what Hale does is he decides to portray a Dutch schoolmaster. So he leaves a lot of his more expensive possessions at home in the camp, heads up to Norwalk, Connecticut, because they decide that's the first place they can cross the Sound to Long Island without being stopped by British warships that are patrolling the Sound. He goes on foot to portray a poor schoolmaster, takes a sergeant who's a friend along. They meet up in Norwalk with a captain of a privateering vessel, which is a private vessel commissioned by the government to attack the enemy vessels. Captain Stephen Pond, who was a friend from the regiment. Pond agrees him to take him across to Huntington, where they land in what's now known as Hale site, north of Huntington Village. And this boulder was originally, with these plaques, was put where he landed and then later moved by the town of Huntington because they were developing the area to a traffic circle halfway in towards Huntington. So he leaves. The stories about Hale vary on all kinds of details. It's not clear if he leaves his sergeant friend in Norwalk or the sergeant friend sails across the sound and then goes back after Hale goes ashore. But Hale is now heading west towards the city, trying to get information about British intentions and dispositions on Long Island. Hale has bad luck, as you know, the ending, but it starts right away because this gentleman, primarily Robert Rogers, is a famous commander of a unit called Rogers Rangers in the French and Indian War, and they sort of fought like Indians and gathered intelligence. And he was very successful. So when the revolution breaks out, he basically plays both sides. He goes to George Washington trying to get a commission to form a unit of Americans, of patriots, to do what he did in the French and Indian War. He also goes to General Howe, the British commander, and tries to do the same thing. Washington picks up on some of this, tries to have Rogers arrested, but Rogers gets away. And then Howe commissions him to be a colonel and form a regiment that would be known as the Queen's American Rangers. In the mission that Rogers is given is to patrol Long Island Sound, gather intelligence, patrol on Long Island Sound for spies, basically form a whole intelligence network on Long Island and try to get information about what the Patriots are doing up in New England, because that's where most of the Patriots have already left Long Island when the British occupied Long Island after the Battle of Long Island. So the captain of the HMS Halifax, which is a British sloop of war that's basically detached to be at Rogers' service, he learns about two privateers that have crossed the Sound the night before, and it's too late to catch up to them, but he alerts Rogers, who comes aboard, and they try to figure out where. They're pretty convinced that the privateers put one or more spies ashore. So Rogers heads west, figuring that the spy would be heading towards the city. He comes ashore on Sands Point, and within a day, after asking around, and people start talking about some stranger who's been asking questions about what the British troops are up to. So within a day, he catches up to Hale, not quite sure where. We think it's probably somewhere in the Great Neck area. He goes into a tavern where he's told Hale is having dinner, sits down at the table, invites himself to join Hale, starts talking, and basically says that he is also a Patriot spy gathering information. And they start talking, and Hale, being gullible, spills the beans on exactly who he is and what he's doing. Rogers says, why don't we meet tomorrow morning at my inn and for breakfast, and we'll continue our conversation. And what's going on is Rogers wants Hale to repeat his incriminating information in front of witnesses. So when Hale shows up the next morning, there's several of the Rangers with Rogers, and they sort of pick up the conversation. And once Hale has incriminated himself in front of witnesses, he's arrested, taken by boat to Howe's headquarters in Manhattan, and is hanged the next day. And like everything about Hale, there's lots of different versions. There's disputes about where exactly he was hanged in Manhattan, and there's a lot of disputes about what he said before they pulled the ladder that he was standing on with a noose over a tree limb out and let him strangle. It's almost certain he did not say what everybody learns in fourth grade, that supposedly he said, "I only regret that I have but one life to lose for my country." It's a very nice quote. Unfortunately, it's lifted word for word from a popular play of the time called Cato, written by Joseph Addison. And somebody put those words in Nathan Hale's mouth sometime in the early 1800s. So we know he's dead. There's dispute where he's buried. dispute whether he was on his way back to Huntington or still going west when he was captured. A lot of research is going on now about Nathan Hale. Regardless of how it fell apart, after the Hale's unsuccessful mission, Washington tries again to set up an intelligence gathering system. Second attempt isn't much better. He hires a gentleman named Nathaniel Sackett from Fishkill up on the Hudson, who's a merchant in New York City, to set up a spy network. And I'm not sure why, what his credentials were that Washington thought he could do it. Sackett does a pretty bad job and only lasts a month before Washington pays him off and gets rid of him. But Washington does much better with the person he picks to be Sackett's liaison with the Army. And that's a young officer from Setauket named Benjamin Talmadge, who has come to Washington's notice. And Washington is very good at finding young aides with military talent. And Talmadge is a Yale classmate of Hale, very bright, very energetic. And Washington says, okay, you will coordinate between me and Sackett. So they arrange to put the first successful spy on Long Island, who's Major John Clark, who's a Pennsylvania lawyer who enlisted in 1775. And he spends much of 1777 on Long Island successfully gathering intelligence, puts together a whole ring of informants. The British don't know he's there. They never even come close to capturing him. But after about a year, he's reassigned to spy in his native Philadelphia, leaving Washington in the dark again. And then Washington, luckily, out of the blue, gets a letter from a whaleboat captain named Nathaniel Oyster. You see here in this 1950s era mural from the Setauket School on the right. He's meeting with Abraham Woodhull, who his neighbor and friend, who becomes the chief spy in the Culper Spy Ring. So Brewster, unsolicited, writes a letter to Washington from Setauket on August 7, 1778, which is a good date to basically say this is the beginning of the Culper Spy Ring. So he offers to gather and send reports on intelligence on what's happening on Long Island Sound and on Long Island. Washington is thrilled, says spare no expense to gather the information and make sure it's accurate. Do not give me any speculation. I need to know the facts. So Brewster writes his first letter 2 weeks later, talking about Sir Henry Clinton, who's now the British commander in New York, planning to attack Patriot forces in Newport, which allows Washington to alert the garrison there and take precautions to stave off the attack. After he fires Sackett, he said, okay, I need somebody else to run the spy ring. He gives that job to General Charles Scott, who's the commander of a infantry division, infantry brigade from Virginia. Scott has to run his unit, which has been fighting the British north of Manhattan. He doesn't show much interest or have much time to run the spy ring. So a lot of this falls on Talmadge, which is actually a good thing. Scott is sort of a proponent of the Nathan Hale model, where you send spies behind enemy lines. The other model that is advanced by Talmadge is you find somebody who's either behind enemy lines or you put them there and you leave them there and let them sort of assimilate into the community so that they're not obvious like Nathan Hale was, standing out as a stranger. This goes on, this tug of war goes on. Finally, Washington sours on Scott and Scott's methods. It says the spies he's arranged have not produced much information, while Talmadge's embedded model seems to be working. So Scott takes the hint and it gives up running the spy network and actually gives up being in the Army. He resigns his commission as a general and goes back to Virginia. So meanwhile, Talmadge has recruited another childhood friend, Abraham Woodhull, who's a farmer out in Pawtucket. This was his house, which has not survived. And Woodhull becomes the chief spy of the spy ring. Ultimately becomes known as Samuel Culper, and then later Culper Sr. So we're not sure when Woodhull is recruited, but we know from the letters that they write that by October 1778, what becomes known as the Culper Spy Ring, which is only given that name long after the war, is in full operation. So they know the British know they have set up a spy ring. They know the British have very sophisticated spies. So they're worried about security. Talmadge, Washington, and Woodhull discuss it constantly. Woodhull is sort of a nervous Nelly in almost every letter he writes, that he's worried about security. They're worried about questioned by the British because he's originally going into New York. And he asked Washington and Talmadge to destroy his letters every time they receive one, which they do only in the very beginning, and then they keep them, which is why the Library of Congress and other museums have a lot of them now. So sometime in the fall of 1778, Woodhull begins traveling to Manhattan, comes back and meets with Caleb Brewster and gives him verbal reports, and then eventually starts writing letters. This is Talmadge now. Once Scott resigns, rather than finding another general, Washington realizes that Talmadge has the talent, even though he's 24, to do this better than anybody else that he could find. So he elevates Talmadge to be his, quote, director of military intelligence at the age of only 24. So initially, Woodhull is running the whole operation, handling couriers as they recruit them, and traveling into the city under the guise of being a farmer, to bring in provisions. But he's riding in on horseback generally, and raising suspicion. There's not only British sentries along the East River ferries that question him, but there's also bands of loyalists, sort of marauders running around who would stop him and search him. Every time he goes in, they remember him and say, you again, and they get more and more belligerent. So Woodhull gets increasingly fearful of going into the city and relates this to Washington and Talmadge. So they all agree they need to find somebody in the city who can stay in the city and send out information by courier. And Washington asks Woodhull to do it, but Woodhull is afraid and also has a farm to run, and he has his elderly parents living with him. And he said, I'm not your man. But he does come up with the perfect person, and that's Robert Townsend of Oyster Bay, who's in the city as the purchasing agent for his father, Samuel, who runs a very big shipping and merchandise operation, import operation in Oyster Bay. The two of them know each other because when Woodhull would go into the city, he would stay at the boarding house owned by his brother-in-law, Amos Underhill. And early on in his time in the city, before he stayed in there permanently, Townsend stayed at the same boarding house. So they got to know each other and trust each other. So finally, Woodhull says, would you be the spy in the city? Washington and Talmadge approve, and he's now the spy. He sets one condition. He said nobody outside of Woodhull and Talmadge and the couriers meeting him to get the letters can ever know who he is, particularly Washington or anybody else in headquarters. So they begin to ramp up security. Initially, they're just doing letters in plain written English, but they realize they need to start to give themselves some protection. So they start to adopt aliases. So Townsend becomes Culper Jr. because Woodhull's already Samuel Culper. Woodhull then switches over to be Culper Sr. And then they go on from there. So what they do is they have a very circuitous route. And this is cover the book. This is a painting by Mort Kunstler, the very famous historical artist from Oyster Bay. This is his vision of Robert Townsend. There's no real paintings of Townsend. All we have is that one drawing done by his nephew. But what they do is they gather information, usually by Townsend or occasionally Woodhull, and the couriers are still going into the city. They send the information out. They come across the East River by ferry with their horse and ride 55 miles out to Setauket. And then they meet up with Caleb Brewster, who would come with several whale boats and cross the Sound in several hours of rowing, get to Norwalk or Fairfield, and then initially Talmadge is waiting there. He takes the messages directly to headquarters north of the city. Then Washington says to Talmadge, you're too valuable to waste time riding back and forth. So Talmadge who's the head of an officer in a dragoon regiment, has his men stationed three at a time every 15 miles along the route to speed the information to Washington. If Washington and Talmadge want information or want to get a message back to the spies, they repeat the same route in reverse. It can take up to a week to make that circuit one way. Washington complains frequently in all the letters throughout the war that it's taking too long to get the information, and they need to speed it up. So they try at various times to run the information via Staten Island and straight from Manhattan north out of Port Washington. Nothing works, so the entire operation for the entire war goes around this circular route. But what they do is they keep recruiting people they know, relatives or people they know, because they don't want outsiders that might be British spies. They set up dedicated couriers, the most famous of whom is Austin Rowe, who you see here, having just crossed the East River and now is on the 55-mile ride back to Setauket. He owns a tavern in Setauket, which is, gives him a good cover story when he goes to Manhattan, because he claims to be buying supplies for the tavern. Again, he's riding by horse, so he's not carrying a lot of supplies, but he manages never to be apprehended. So they keep adding levels of security, but just to give you an idea of what the letters look like, this is early on. This is a letter from Woodhull to Washington that would go through the couriers to Talmadge to Washington. And if you see here, he's signing it with the initials SC for Samuel Culper. So this is early on, before Townsend has gotten involved in the city. So we know of 193 letters that total 383 pages written by the different participants. So this is letters by Washington, Talmadge, the spies, or Caleb Brewster, who sort of doubled as courier and spy. And new ones periodically come to light. Most recently, last summer, this letter was found in the archives at the Long Island Museum in Stony Brook. It was actually donated to the museum in 1951, listed in a ledger of being accepted, but never actually cataloged. So the museum didn't know in recent years they had it until they found it last summer when they were closed and spent that time organizing their archives. This is the back. And this, you can see, is signed by John Bolton, which is the Talmadge's initial spy name. And this letter you can see on their website, and will actually be displayed in person starting on Culper Spy Day, which is in September. So as I said, the letters were supposed to be destroyed and weren't, which is why we have these letters still exist. If in theory, at least all the letters going to Washington and Talmadge was supposed to be destroyed, but were not. So they continue during the war, upgrade their spycraft. They start with those initial code names or aliases, and then they keep increasing the security. This is a list, and what they do is early on, Woodhull says to Talmadge and Scott that we should give everybody aliases. So that's when they come up with John Bolton for Talmadge, Samuel Culper for Abraham Woodhull, and etc. So that's the first layer of security. So none of the letters mention any real names, except Caleb Brewster, who was kind of fearless and basically used his real name throughout the war and refused to have a code name or spy name. So they start out with this list of aliases. This system is devised by Woodhull and employed on his letter of April 10th, 1779 for the first time. And then they come up with a new system. They start using digits to replace place names. Number 10 stands in for New York. 30 and 44 become post riders, Jonas Hawkins and Austin Rowe. Setauket becomes number 20, and so on. So they use this for a while. But then Talmadge is still concerned that it's not secure enough after studying other codes. And these are all amateurs, so everything they're doing is pretty amazing that they sort of invent this from scratch. So after putting these numerical ciphers in 10 letters bound for New York and 20 going the other way, Talmadge says this isn't good enough. So in July of 1779, he comes with a major upgrade by preparing what he calls the dictionary. This is the only known surviving copies in the Library of Congress. And this is a vastly expanded code system. And what he does is he comes up with 710 words that would be most likely to be used in the messages, such as Congress, gun, Navy, and Tory. Then next to them, he writes numbers in alphabetical order, and these become the substitutions. So now if you want to say many, you'd say 384. If you want to say murder, you'd write 387. And this goes on. Here you can see some of the important words on the side there and their code replacements. In addition to the 710 words that are given their own codes, 53 prominent nouns, people, places are given their own numbers from 711 to 763. So Talmadge now becomes 721 rather than John Bolton. Woodhull is 722, Townsend is 723, and so on. You can see the examples here with their numbers. Then there's also a coded alphabet for words not listed and a substitution where they're using numbers for letters and vice versa that you can see in this column. And you can spend hours going through this to really understand it, but that's the real basics. So between the code names and the initial numbers and this final dictionary, they come up with the best level of security at all, which is secret ink. And this is sort of dropped as a gift into George Washington's lap. What happens is James J., who's a doctor and amateur chemist who spends time in London before the war, he's the brother of John Jay, who becomes the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. John Jay writes a letter to Washington saying, my brother has invented a stain, that's what they call it, has invented a stain that is invisible once put on paper and can only be read if it's treated with a second chemical, which they call the counterpart. And this is a big advance over existing known invisible writing techniques. Like people would use lemon juice, so they would write in milk and then it would disappear. But if you put a candle on and heated the paper, it shows up. The stain is only revealable with that second chemical, so it's extremely secure. The problem is it's also supremely rare. It takes 6 months for James J. to get the first batch to Washington after Washington expresses interest in it, because the chemicals are very hard to find. Washington says, if we can help you find the chemicals, let me know. You can go to any military hospital and get them in my name. And then James J. said, that's only half the problem. I need a laboratory like I had in England to make it. So Washington actually has his engineering officers build a lab for James J. But even then, the chemical is hard to come by. And there's many periods. It takes months for Washington to get any to the spies once he gets it. And then throughout the war, there's periods when they can't get it. So they have to go back to the code system alone, which exposes them to danger because some of their dispatches are captured by the British on the Connecticut shoreline. Okay, so that is the basic, very quick explanation of how the spy ring was formed and how it operated. There's much more detail in the book. But what I want to do is focus on some of the more interesting subgenres and areas of speculation and dispute that get people's blood boiling when they come to the spy ring. Probably the most famous anecdotal account of the spy ring that gets the most attention in Turn and other books is the role or lack thereof of Anna Strong's clothesline out in Setauket. She's a neighbor of Abraham Woodhull, lives across the bay from him. And the story that first shows up as fact in Morton Pennypacker's books in the 1930s is that Anna Strong would hang a black putty coat on her clothesline down by the harbor to alert Woodhull that Caleb Brewster has shown up with his whaleboats somewhere in the area. And then she would supposedly hang 1 to 6 white handkerchiefs on the clothesline to indicate which of 6 local bays Caleb Brewster was waiting at. Anna Strong is married to Patriot leader and judge Selah Strong, who had been imprisoned by the British for surreptitious correspondence with the enemy. So Pennypacker wrote in one of his books that he and other historians had spent decades trying to figure out how Woodhull knew where to find Brewster. He writes in his 1939 book, "Finally, a clue was found among the papers of the Floyd family." That's William Floyd, the Declaration of Independence signer. Was found in the papers of the Floyd family, and when this was compared with Woodhull account book, it was discovered that the signals were arranged by no less a personage than the wife of Judge Selah Strong. And so Pennypacker writes this without giving any footnotes or actual documentation, but he says this is how he discovered it. The story is picked up by Strong family historian Kate Strong in the 1960s. She wrote a family history that has a chapter titled "In Defense of Nancy's Clothesline," where people have expressed skepticism about this was a legend or fact, and she says, no, it's true. And she says it's corroborated by scraps of paper, deeds, journals, and letters in her possession, as well as documents she saw or was told about by Morton Pennypacker, which are now in the East Hampton Library. So many historians ever since the 30s have repeated this clothesline story without any skepticism. But there's no reference to a clothesline being used in any of the letters. Now, it could be true. We don't know. It's just not in the letters. It's possible that Anna Strong needed to tell Woodhull where to meet Caleb Brewster, and she could have done it with the clothesline because she was staying at the servants' quarters where the clothesline was because the British were occupying their house. She could have just ridden a horse or walked around the half-mile shoreline to Woodhull's house or rode across the bay. But we also know that a lot of these rendezvous were arranged in advance, either in earlier letters or when they were meeting. They could say, okay, I'll be back in 2 weeks and I'll meet you in Conscience Bay or whatever the situation was. So it's, as far as I'm concerned, it's a nice story. It's an unproven legend, although it's treated like fact, but in turn, in Brian Kilmeade's book and lots of other places. Another subject of controversy is the role in the spy ring or lack thereof of publisher James Rivington, who's either a very ardent Tory or makes a very good attempt at portraying himself to be an ardent Tory. Or even before the war, he's printing a series of very pro-British loyalist newspapers in Manhattan, to the point where the Sons of Liberty come visiting one night and destroy his office and his printing press, forcing him to flee to London. But he does come back once the Battle of Long Island and the British take over, and starts printing another newspaper called the Royal Gazette, which makes scandalous reports about Washington and the Patriots, and talks about what the British are doing and how great they are. All that is fact. The paper is printed on Hanover Square, which is across the square from Robert Townsend's store and importing business. So that's all the facts. Then it gets pretty iffy after that. A lot of authors, in turn, they'll have Townsend writing for the Royal Gazette, Townsend being a partner in the Royal Gazette. Rivington also, we know, owned a coffee shop and a general store that sold stationery adjacent to his printing office. And we have people saying that, without any documentation, that Townsend was a partner in the coffee shop or a frequent visitor of the coffee shop, or he owned part of the general store. Again, none of this has been substantiated. There's no Robert Townsend kept scrupulous account books. There's nothing in any of them of any reference to Rivington, other than the fact that he bought the newspaper, which everybody in Manhattan was doing, whether they were Patriot or Tory. Even Morton Pennypacker. Now, so a lot of people say that Rivington was actually a member of the spy ring, that he was feeding information to Townsend to give to get out to Woodhull and off to Talmadge in Washington. No proof of any of this, other than when the British occupation ends and Talmadge goes into New York City, he's known to have protected people that were spies or helped the American cause, but we don't know if he helped Rivington or not. So again, this is a great area of speculation. There's more speculation concerning John Andre, who's the British equivalent of Talmadge. He's the chief spy and spy master for the British in New York and North America. And his name keeps popping up in the spy accounts. In particular, there is one letter written by Woodhull that he mentions a woman. A woman in the code is 355. So he writes about a month after Townsend starts spying in the city in August of 1779. He writes a letter and says, I intend to visit 727, which is New York, before long, and think by the assistance of a 355 or lady of my acquaintance shall be able to outwit them all. This is the only letter of the 193 that they mention a woman at all. And this 355 woman becomes a whole source of speculation in turn, in Brian Kilmeade's bestseller, in lots of books, and things get a little crazy. So Beverly Tyler, the historian for the Three Village Historical Society, who spent 40 years studying the spy ring, thinks the woman involved is Anna Strong, because they were friends, and she occasionally was known to go to the city with him, and sometimes to betray his wife, to throw off the sentries. So it could have been Anna Strong. And he just says 355. Brian Kilmeade and other people turn her into Agent 355, which we know is BS, because the term agent for spies was never used by anybody during the Revolution. But the speculation just gets way outside the box. People have turned this woman 355 into a mistress of Townsend, and say that she ends up getting captured by the British, thrown into one of the British prison hulks ships off the Brooklyn shore. And then she dies there, or depending on the version, she survives. Some people say she bore Townsend's illegitimate child. It just gets really crazy. Brian Kilmeade, the Fox News host, his version is that she's Agent 355, and he says that she was probably from a loyalist family in the city who hung out at the lavish social functions that John Andre liked to hold in New York City, and then for some reason she decides to help the Patriots. But again, all we know is there's one mention of a woman in one letter. Everything else is unproven and total speculation. But it's got this whole debate going among historians about what was going on. Okay, so I've picked on Turn a lot, but let me give you, people love Turn. I don't. I did a story for Newsday tearing it apart for all the historical inaccuracies, but our TV critic at the time thought it was great TV. And if you look at Facebook, every time Turn comes up, people love it. They watch it over and over again. But they destroy the history, despite the fact they used Alexander Rose's book, which is the first serious modern history that gets most of the history right, as their guide. They bought the rights. They hired Alexander Rose as their historical consultant, and then twisted the story where it suited them for dramatic license. So some of the examples are in the series, they create the spy ring in 1776, 2 years before it actually started. They show Setauket as this well-established community of brick homes, because they filmed in Virginia near Williamsburg, when Setauket at the time was this little cluster of salt block wooden houses. But it gets worse. They show the British troops on Long Island as redcoats, British regulars, when in fact they were loyalist units formed from Tories, particularly the Queen's Rangers, formed by Colonel Simcoe, who was based in Oyster Bay, who you see in this painting. But then the two worst things that Turn does is they show Woodhull's father, who is a local minister, as an ardent Tory, and he's actually a very ardent patriot. The British, have seen enough of Woodhull and being tipped off by loyalists that he's probably a spy. So they go out. Simcoe leaves Oyster Bay, goes out with the Queen's Rangers to apprehend and question Abraham Woodhull. When they get there, luckily for Abraham Woodhull, he's in the city spying. but Woodhull's father is in town. So he's apprehended, he's questioned and almost beaten to death by the Queen's Rangers trying to find out where the son is. In the series, they show Woodhull's father, sitting cozily with Simcoe and the other officers drinking tea. So that's a pretty major historical violation in my book. And then the other one I really particularly offended by is the series starts with establishing Woodhull in Setauket, and they show him having a romantic relationship with Anna Strong, who is not only happily married, is 10 years older than Woodhull, but has 6 young children that keep her pretty busy. So I don't know where she'd have the time or inclination to have a romantic relationship with Abraham Woodhull. And there's zero factual basis for that. So it's historical fiction. People like it, that's fine. But the problem is people see that series and think that's the real story of the Spy Ring. I do give them credit, along with Brian Kilmeade's historical fiction masquerading as fact, for getting a lot of interest in recent years in the Spy Ring. So enough picking on the other versions. Let's talk about the real value of the Spy Ring. Historians have great disparity in the credit they give the Spy Ring for helping to win the war. All of them give it some credit. Brian Kilmeade is the outlier on the positive side. His subtitle of this book is the Spy Ring that won the war. So he literally gives the Spy Ring credit for winning the war all on their own, and that wasn't the Continental Army and the Spy Ring. He says the spy operation won the war, which every other historian thinks is huge hyperbole. Benjamin Talmadge, now he's obviously biased because he's running the Spy Ring and helped really create it. He said it was very valuable after the war. He writes a memoir that was never published, was just for his children. And in it, he says how beneficial it was to the commander-in-chief is evidenced by his continuing the same to the close of the war. Now, Washington did use it, well, there were times he actually shut it down, but he did rely on the Culpers for most of the war, but part of that was he could never come up with any alternatives that were any better. So he expressed a lot of frustration, and that increased exponentially during the course of the war at the delays it took to get information, or there were times when the Culpers were not providing anything. After Benedict Arnold becomes a British general and goes into New York, his first thing he does is try to capture all the spies in New York. So Townsend abandons the city for months because he's afraid of being captured. The Spy Ring basically ceases to function. Washington basically says, okay, I'm sort of decommissioning the Spy Ring. And he does that for several months until the French enter the war. And then he's desperate for information so that he and the French can cooperate, and goes back and tells Talmadge to get the Culpers back into the game. Early on, Washington is very positive. When Caleb Brewster and Woodhull and Townsend first provide the information, Washington is ecstatic. He writes in the July 1780 letter that he finds the intelligence, quote, of very great importance. In another letter, he says, I rely upon this intelligence. In April of 1781, he wrote that of their ability, I entertain a high opinion. So clearly in the beginning, he's very high on the Culpers. But things go bad, as I said, because of gaps in their intelligence and his increasing frustration with the time it takes to get the information to him. He says, it's always accurate, but by the time I get it, sometimes the situation has changed, so I can't do anything with it. And many times I get the same information from other sources more rapidly. So by the end of the war, he's gotten pretty sour. He's also moved his army to Yorktown in Virginia. So the information coming out of New York is less important to him. But in any case, he learns that the British are going to agree to a peace treaty and independence in one of the last letters from Townsend, because Townsend hears it in New York before Washington learns about it from the British capture, the British army he's captured in Virginia. So at the end of the war, Talmadge sends an accounting of expenses due expense money due to the members of the spy ring. Now, none of them were ever paid. They were all volunteers, but Washington would reimburse them for the money they were laying out for expenses. So when he gets a letter in September 1783 with an accounting from Talmadge, Washington is kind of angry and sends it back for more details. And he writes about Woodhull. He said, the services which were rendered by him, however well meant, was by no means adequate to those expenditures, because his communications were never frequent and always tedious in getting to hand. So at this point, he's very sour on the spy ring. But despite that, historians agree there were several instances where the spy ring proved extremely valuable to Washington, even though he wasn't willing to admit that at the end of the war. For one thing, Brewster and Woodhull are providing constant stream of intelligence about which regiments were in what town and with what strength, and if they were moving to get provisions in one place. And they're also recommending repeatedly suggestions for attacking forts or columns. And there are at least three times when Talmadge relayed that information to Washington with recommendations that they make the attack, and they did it. The most famous is in November 1780, Talmadge comes across with a whaleboat raid from Connecticut and attacks Fort St. George, which was a fort built out of a colonial plantation in Mastic on the Great South Bay. They achieve great surprise. They capture the fort, capture all the British soldiers, kill a few, take prisoners back to Connecticut, and on the way, they burn the British supply ship in the background, and they learn about 300 tons of hay stockpiled in Coram for British cavalry horses in the city, and they burn that before going back to Connecticut. Another instance of their value was there was a sailmaker in Manhattan who professed to be a patriot and gathering intelligence for the Patriots. Townsend finds out from his sources that Christopher Duchenek is actually a double agent, and he's exposed. It's not clear what happens to him, but I'm assuming he was arrested, if not hanged. One of the most important things that the ring did is the British throughout the war tried to counterfeit continental currency. They figure if they flood the market with phony bills, it'll create huge inflation and the Americans won't be able to finance the war anymore. In the beginning, it's pretty clumsy. They're using different paper than the official continental currency. So any merchants and people that are familiar with the money right away realize it's fake. But then Townsend writes a letter in 1779 in the fall and said he has learned that the British have acquired the exact same paper in Philadelphia that the Continental Congress is using to print the real money. So he tells Washington. Washington is alarmed. A week later, writes a letter to Congress alerting them. For some reason, Congress waits 3 months, but then recalls all the currency and prints new money. So the British scheme to make the war unaffordable is thwarted. And there's other examples. So they clearly have helped, even though Washington is not happy with them at the end of the war. So I'm going to wrap up with a little bit of a postscript. In 1790, Washington is now president, and the year before, Alexander Hamilton, his first Treasury Secretary, recommends that he go out and see the country and meet his constituents. And Washington, as a farmer, is always interested in what the soil conditions are and what people are growing. So in 1789, he takes a long trip looping through New England. And then in April of 1790, he spends 5 days traveling on Long Island. And he stops and he travels along the South Shore through Brooklyn out to Jamaica and then out to Patchogue, and then heads north through Coram up to Setauket, and works his way back along the North Shore to Manhattan. So this is a painting of his coach that he traveled in. So a lot of historians, I'm not sure I buy into this either, a lot of historians believe Washington made the trip primarily to meet and thank members of the Culper Spy Ring. His diary makes no indication of that. He takes very extensive notes, talks about who he meets, where he stays, what he ate, a lot of attention paid to the soil conditions, what's being grown, the topography, geography, nothing at all about the spies. But he stays in Patchogue at the home of a minor player in the spy ring. And then this is where he stays in a modern painting and thing in Roslyn on the way back. But the main connection to the spy ring is the night he stays in Setauket, stays at Row Tavern, which still exists out there. It's been moved, but it still exists. This is the tavern owned by the courier Austin Rowe from the spy ring. So people say, well, if he stayed in Austin Rowe's tavern, he must have known that Rowe was the courier for the spy ring. The problem with that is Washington, throughout the war, said, I do not want to know who was in the spy ring to protect them. The members of the spy ring did not want anybody at headquarters other than Talmadge knowing who they were. So it's not clear if Washington, even after the war, knew. Some historians say it's inevitable because of the people that Washington knew who the spies were. I'm not convinced. The other problem with the connection at Austin Rowe's Tavern is Rowe is down in the South Shore when he learns that Washington is on the road and heading for his tavern. Rowe rides to try to get ahead of Washington and get set up for the presidential visit, gets either falls off or is thrown from his horse and breaks his leg. It's never clear in any of the writings that have survived if Rowe even got to the tavern when Washington was there. Washington writes in his diary that it's a very nice tavern, the food was good, he likes the residents, doesn't make any mention to meeting Rowe, let alone saying that Rowe was part of the spy ring. And there's no indication from on Rowe's side whether he actually got to the tavern. So this is another one of these areas open to great interpretation. We may never know why Washington went to see Long Island. Based on what we actually know for a fact in Washington's diary, I think he probably did not know. There's really no reason why he wouldn't have said in his diary long after the war, I met this spy or that courier. So I'm not convinced. But great interest in the spy ring from the books and turn to the point in 2017, the folks out in the Stony Brook area persuade the state to create the Washington Spy Trail, which they mark. It's 55 miles from Great Neck out to Port Jefferson. It marks sites either connected to the spy ring or at least connected to the Revolution. And they have a website, and they generate a lot of interest. So that's the true story. That's me at the end of the spy trail in Port Jeff, and Stephen will see if there's any questions in the chat, and you can ask your questions. If you raise your hand, Stephen will recognize you. I do want to point out that this is the 8th lecture that I have in circulation. If you'd like to know or see what I'm doing, see where the other lectures are, I put them on the Long Island History page on Facebook. I have a email blast group. You can email me at billbleyer@gmail.com. I will put you on the list. Also, if you can buy the book now on Amazon. It's in every bookstore on Long Island. Every library will have it. Big box stores like Target and Walmart carry it. But if you're into this story and you'd like a signed and inscribed copy, you can email me at billbleyer@gmail.com, and I will make arrangements for that. So I'm going to stop the share, and let's see if anybody has any questions. It's like a lot of the other things with the spy ring, there's different versions. I mean, I've seen a lot of evidence that Washington had tried to have him arrested. It may have been that he learned he had gone to Hale because Washington wasn't giving him what he wanted. I know Washington apparently offered him a commission, but I guess it wasn't either high enough rank or of sufficient quality in Rogers' mind. So I know he went to Washington and then went to Hale.
Yeah.
It may have been at that point that Washington tried to have him arrested. I'd have to go back and look at my notes. I don't remember the story exactly. But the whole, everything about Rogers during the Revolution and all the spying and all the Nathan Hale connections, there's like 12 different versions of everything. It's very confusing.
Yeah, thank you.
But there's a great, if you're into Rogers, I grew up reading Kenneth Roberts'
Yes.
novel, which I still love.
Yes.
He's a great character, but Kenneth Rogers portrayed him as kind of this really noble character, but the real Rogers was pretty despicable. He lied and cheated and did all kinds of nasty things, double-crossed people left and right.
Well, this biography by John Ross is quite adulatory as well.
And Catherine asks, other than the numbered Culper Ring members, is there any evidence that the network included any more people?
We know for a fact that if you count Talmadge, the spies, the couriers, people that were informants, there's at least a dozen, I named them in the book, there's at least a dozen people who everybody, who studied this for decades agrees is in the spy ring. Some of them are not particularly well known. There's Phillips Rowe was a courier and an informant in Port Jefferson, and you can go see his house. He's not particularly well known, but there's no doubt that he was a member, and a contributed to the spy ring. So you have Brian Kilmeade, he calls it the Secret Six. He decides there were only 6 people in the spy ring, which is nonsense because I name about 12 of them in my book. And in his 6 does not include Caleb Brewster, or Abraham Woodall for that matter. But, without Caleb Brewster, there's no spy ring. You can't get the message across the Long Island Sound without Caleb Brewster. But in Brian Kilmeade's book, he doesn't include him as even being in the spy ring, let alone being an indispensable link across the Sound. So, there's a lot of historic houses on Long Island, like Saginaw Coast Manor was, we know the Patriot was an owner. We don't know. He's related by marriage to Woodhull. I mean, he logically, I'm sure, the British occupied his house. He was shot at. It's pretty clear that I'm sure that he supported the Patriot cause, probably was supplying information to the spy ring through his relatives, but we don't have any proof of that. So there's at least a dozen that we know, factually can prove were connected and contributing. There's probably 3 times that many where the people that own a historic house say, "Oh, I'm sure so-and-so, was involved and was a member," but they don't have any proof. But there's a lot of people that I'm sure were just informing, so they're not really considered part of the spy ring. But there are people that knew these spies and would say, "Oh, I just saw this regiment walking through Huntington." So it depends what you want to define as members of the spy ring. But the regular known contributors, there were at least a dozen that are proven, and probably 2 or 3 times that many who had some kind of regular contributing factor, but there's no proof of it. Anybody else?
Well, I thank everybody for zooming in tonight, and I thank you, Bill Bleyer, for an excellent presentation. Best of luck with the book, and I put in the chat if anyone would like to purchase signed copies. You can purchase signed copies by emailing billbleyer@gmail.com. And as Bill said, the book is available in all the local bookstores, Bookhampton, Barnes and Noble, and on Amazon. And is it available from Arcadia Press, the publisher?
Yeah, it's published by Arcadia, which now owns the History Press. Like I said, if you're on Long Island, it'll be available everywhere. I see we have people from Wales and California, which is terrific. It's on Amazon. It's on, probably on Walmart.com and other internet sellers.
Well, I thank you for this presentation, and we'll surely have another presentation as some more materials arise, which they usually do because things are always turning up.
Great.
So,
well, I thank you, Stephen. Thanks to the East Hampton Library, and I hope to see you folks on another lecture sometime soon.
have a great evening.